Magnifico. Chapter 1. Things must change. In most monarchies, the king claims sovereignty over his people, but in the Kingdom of Roses, King Magnifico's subjects were the tyrants. It was his fault, he thought regretfully, for using sorcery in the first place to begin granting wishes. He should have remembered that a genie was a prisoner to the whims of others, and so too his ability left him at his people's mercy. I want 1,000,000 coins. A parakeet, a banana split, a swimming pool, a trampoline, A little boy licking a lollipop was sitting on his lap, demanding. Well, we'll see about that. Magnifico glanced around for the boy's parents. How did you get past the guards? The palace gates, flanked by statuesque soldiers, led to the long, carpeted hallway that opened to the throne room. There the king sat upon his throne, resplendent in star-stitched robes, with all the dignity of Father Christmas. Great. When grown-ups say, we'll see about that, it always means yes. The little boy jumped up off the king's lap, then skipped away, outside into the queue of people waiting their turn to make a wish. Resentfully, King Magnifico raised his scepter, then granted the boy's wishes with a sweeping shimmer, since he had no heart to disappoint him. As the boy disappeared, someone else stepped forward, shoulders slumped in sorrow. My king, said a peasant girl, coming up to the throne, clutching a shawl around herself. My mother twisted her ankle, and can no longer walk after slipping on one of her chicken's eggs. She can't even stand upright. Will you heal her? King Magnifico quickly forgot the previous boy's entitlement, and nodded. A twisted ankle. That is a serious affliction, swollen to the size of the egg she slipped on. The king raised his scepter, then waved it in an arc, healing the girl's mother at once. There, her pain is gone now, he said as the girl's eyes widened, and a smile spread across her face. She bowed, then turned to leave, and Magnifico remembered briefly why sorcery was a blessing. But no sooner had the girl disappeared, than through the grand doors strode a middle-aged man with fox-like features and an air of impatience. A long travelling cloak billowed behind him as he marched with a walking stick up to the king, who studied him with a steady gaze. Your Majesty, the man began without even a bow, I come to you with a request. I have heard of your power to grant wishes, and seek your aid. The king leaned forward. Magnifico possessed an innate desire to help those in need, and often found it difficult to say no, but he grew weary since lately it was becoming clear that a fool who makes a wish often finds that what he desires has consequences. Well, go ahead. Magnifico waved his hand. Speak your wish. The man's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered it, then said without shame, I wish for absolute power. I desire to command armies, to rule with an iron fist, and to have the loyalty of every citizen. Magnifico's eyes narrowed, and his voice grew cold as he replied, such a wish speaks to ambition beyond measure. But power without wisdom is a path of which to be wary. Sure. The peasant stood tall as he pulled a scroll from his cloak. Now, let me be clear on the terms and conditions of this wish. No action, policy, or decree should be contested or overturned by any other entity. I require immunity from any form of legal or physical retribution. This wish should remain in effect for the duration of my lifetime, and extend to my successors, ensuring that the absolute power granted is maintained beyond my tenure. Once granted, this wish must be irrevocable to any changes or nullifications. The king's gaze grew colder still. I see, he said. You think you can waltz in here and demand absolute power with such brazen terms. Absolute authority is not a game to be played. It must be wielded with responsibility. The peasant smirked, and folded his arms. Oh, please. Save the moralizing. We've no objection to you as a wizard, you know, but as a king we hate you. King Magnifico's heart rate quickened, but his voice remained even. You are not just seeking to overthrow me, you're aiming to become a tyrant. Power without limits corrupts, and turns rulers into monsters. I will never allow this kingdom to be weakened by the hunger for control. I hereby decree your banishment. Guards, escort this man out of the palace, and ensure he departs from our borders immediately. Any attempt to defy this order will be met with execution. Let it be known our kingdom will always stand against the darkness of greed. We will remain a land of generosity and justice. As the king's words echoed through the throne room, the guards stepped forward with practiced ease. They seized the peasant by the arms, who, despite wriggling like a snake, was no match for their strength. The guards dragged him towards the gates. I will not be treated like this, the man sputtered, flailing his arms. I demand to speak to someone in charge. I am in charge. Magnifico banged his fist against his throne's armrest. But he began to see that by giving gifts freely, even if he sat on the throne, his people wielded the power. He was constrained by the very magic that defined him, having to listen to 1,000 such ridiculous requests a day. And most times, his subjects couldn't even get their teeth around the word, "Thank you." King Magnifico knew things could not go on this way, and so that night, he asked for the counsel of the person he trusted most to advise him, his dear wife, Amaya, who he called to the top of the tallest tower in his palace. Queen Amaya swept up the grand staircase that curved heavenward in a sky-piercing arc. The mirrors lining the tower reflected her snow-white billowing cape, adorned with royal blue and gold filigree as she made her way to the top. The walls were embellished with astrological carvings and torches casting dancing shadows that followed her ascent. Her husband stood beside a gleaming brass telescope, peering through one of the tall, arched windows that framed a breathtaking view of his kingdom. Clad in ermine robes, he appeared as tall and regal as one of his palace's pillars. "How did it come to this, Amaya?" Magnifico turned. "We built this kingdom to be a haven for everyone, and now it is out of control. I swore I would protect our people, that no one would suffer as I did when my parents were murdered and my homeland was destroyed by thieves." He stepped into the light of the stars that bathed his observatory in a soft glow. Queen Amaya strode across the room filled with celestial globes and charts of stars, and placed a hand on her husband's shoulder. "Times have changed, and the challenges we face grow in number. I fear we cannot protect our people the way we always have. What do you suggest we do? More sorcery? More laws? I don't want our people to feel neglected. I thought by strengthening our defenses, and giving them everything they wanted, I was keeping them safe." Queen Amaya shook her head. "Safety is more than physical protection. Our people need to know their king and queen have their best interests at heart." She moved beside a globe, and stroked it so it spun. "What if we held a ceremony? Something where our subjects can come to us, give up their wishes, and have them sealed and protected by you until you can grant them." Magnifico considered this, his eyes drifting over the moving orrery on the ceiling, its planets and moons rotating in a mesmerizing dance. "We could host it once a month. Each subject can present their wish to you, and you will seal it away. Then, when the time is right, you can grant the wishes that will benefit the kingdom most. And the wishes that do not benefit the kingdom." Queen Amaya hesitated. "They would remain locked away, kept safe but never granted. It would be a way to show our people their king is listening and caring for them. But it will also allow you to use prudence when they do not have good judgment." King Magnifico stroked his short, white beard. "It is a clever idea. Our people will still feel heard and valued. But, Amaya, we may be deceiving them. To give up a wish to sorcery is to lose all memory of your deepest desire. You have witnessed as much magic as I, and know it is always a double-edged sword. To desire less is a blessing." The queen tossed her long, dark braid. "A shallow desire is no virtue. We are protecting them. And this way, you can make sure only wishes that strengthen our kingdom come to pass." The king clenched his fists, and determination filled his eyes. "You're right. This will keep stability in our kingdom. I have lived through the horror of losing everything dear to me. I cannot let our people's selfishness lead this kingdom into ruin as well." As he said this, incessant squeaking of trampoline springs were coming from below, as the spoiled little boy from earlier enjoyed his wishes. Suddenly, the loud crash of something falling over interrupted the noise. King Magnifico's eyes widened as one of his celestial globes shattered into a million glittering fragments, cascading across the floor like a shower of stars. One of the trampoline's springs had stretched too far, and snapped, causing it to clang through one of the tower's stained glass windows. It landed with a thud on the floor. "I did not learn sorcery to let this kingdom crumble into chaos." Magnifico moved forward with deliberate calmness to gather the shards of his precious globe. "Thank you, Amaya. I don't know what I would do without you." His gaze, normally commanding and imperious, held a hint of sorrow. "We're in this together." The queen smiled, and cast her eyes toward the lights outside. She moved to the observation deck, where Magnifico joined her at its railing. The deck offered a panoramic view of Roses. Its night sky hung star-studded above them, and the distant sea surrounding the island, taking blue bites out of the land, mirrored the stars back again. The king and queen shared a moment of silence. Then the queen spun abruptly. "It has been an exhausting day." She put a hand to her forehead, and with a trace of fatigue in her voice, said, "Perhaps it is time for us to retire. You should not stay up late studying astronomy tonight. Indeed, sound slumber serves better than sorcery after a stressful day." Magnifico stooped to fiddle with an astrolabe, Then he and his wife turned toward the observatory's grand doors, and they both departed the tower with more peace in their hearts, for the time being. Chapter 2. The King Seeks an Apprentice. 18 years later, the Kingdom of Roses became a more prosperous land. With newly imposed laws in place, there was less chaos, and it did not attract as many criminals. This was also due to Magnifico using his sorcery to conjure the eclipse enclosure around his kingdom's borders. He used star silk to create the obscuring effect of an eclipse, producing a curtain that veiled his kingdom, ensuring no intruder could breach the sanctity of the realm. Now that Magnifico's subjects had order, they came to respect their king. He rose in popularity because of his success in bringing peace, and his people revered him once again. King Magnifico, I bake these cookies shaped just like you, called one of his subjects. We erected a statue of you in the middle of the kingdom, called another. Remember how horrible our community used to be, when anyone could get whatever they wanted at any moment? An old lady hauled a broken, well-used trampoline to the side of a dumpster. You couldn't even set rules or discipline. King Magnifico strolled through his kingdom with pride in his heart, because he knew he'd made the right decision 18 years ago, and now, Roses thrived. And as long as he was king, he would use his sorcery to ensure it would remain that way, as long as he was king. Amaya, he said, later that night, pacing back and forth in his observatory tower, what will happen to Roses when I am gone? It took me years upon years to master sorcery. If my secrets are not passed on, this kingdom we work to build will not be protected as I protect it now. If only you had a drop of magic in your own blood, for I trust you more than I trust myself. Alas, we must think of another solution. I see why you're concerned. Queen Amaya used slow, measured steps to cross the room toward a curious book lying open on a table. Although you are young for a sorcerer, your hair grows white, and no one can live forever. I am not so young myself. What's this? She flicked through its pages. This is no book of simple sorcery. You are studying forbidden magic. Are you seeking to immortalize yourself? No, I would not consider it. Magnifico heaved the book shut, so Amaya faltered, and stepped back. I am only considering every option available to me. But what do you suggest? I know I can always count on your counsel in trying times. The Queen smiled, and draped herself over one of the globes she spun absent-mindedly. I have one suggestion that may serve you well. Tell me what you would suggest. She cast her gaze to the side, then said, perhaps you should seek an apprentice. Someone you may confide in, and share the weight of your responsibilities with. Someone who also has a drop of magic in their blood, who you can instruct in sorcery and in ruling with a just and wise mind, who will be able to take over for you someday. An apprentice, you say? The king's fingers traced a constellation across one of his star charts. An interesting consideration. Well, Amaya, you have not steered me wrong before, and it is true that having an apprentice would help me to sleep better at night. But how will I be able to find someone who I know I can trust? You may simply decree that whoever believes they are fit for the role may apply. I will hold interviews, and only allow those who are most worthy to move on to meet with you for a final judgment, when you determine whether they are suited to the task. Yes, I suppose we could start searching the kingdom. But what if no one is suited to the task? The Queen averted her gaze. I have been keeping my eye out for a while, she said, and I think you will be surprised by my suggestions. As I said, I have the utmost faith in you. I am sure you will use your wisdom to select a selfless candidate who longs to protect Roses with the same devotion. Someone who, perhaps, may even wish to become the best apprentice a sorcerer could have. We must start our search as soon as possible. The Queen twirled her braid around a finger. Of course we shall, at once. After all, the fate of Roses depends upon it. Word spread quickly that the king was seeking a sorcerer's apprentice, but each candidate the Queen brought before her husband was worse than the next. Amaya stifled a laugh as Magnifico wiped glitter from his face, his expression one of growing irritation. Next, he said from his throne, where he sat evaluating the queue of candidates in front of him. Amaya stood by his side, amusement playing on her lips, as the last contender stormed out of the room, golden curls bouncing behind her. They'd decided to interview the contestants together, as the task had turned out to be more dangerous than one might expect. The girl, Norella, had just had a tantrum because the pink sparkly wand her mother had ordered for her from Paris would not perform magic properly. Its handle was wrapped in a luxurious ribbon of softest silk, dyed a rich shade of lavender and adorned with sequins. She'd presented herself arrogantly to the king, claiming she was already his new apprentice, and that she had exceptional talents. Have you considered that the wand does not work for you, because you do not have a drop of magic in your blood? King Magnifico asked her finally. Of course I do. That's silly. Norella threw the wand, allegedly crafted from finest rosewood, onto the floor. Stupid wand. I'll fix you. And she began stomping on the fancy stick, so a sizzle of sparkles flew out its star-shaped tip into Magnifico's face, before it cracked in half with a heart-wrenching snap. Next, next, next. But if Norella's performance was less than stellar, the other candidates made a dark day darker, and Magnifico could not sleep those nights for worrying over the fate of his kingdom. Instead, underneath the stars wheeling overhead, he peered through the telescope in his tower, or his hands deftly mixed elements in beakers and flasks as he practiced sorcery, puzzling over what their next move should be. A creaking groan echoed across the observatory as one of the grand doors opened. Then Amaya crept inside as quietly as a fox, keeping to the shadows. Amaya, come closer. I need to discuss the recent candidates you've presented to me. Magnifico held up one of his vials to the light. Amaya stepped into the starlight, and approached the king with a respectful bow. My king, I trust you found their qualifications satisfactory. Satisfactory? If by satisfactory you mean a parade of preposterous jesters. Explain to me, why does it seem as though each candidate you bring before me is more suited to a role in a circus than to my court? I'd almost think you were choosing fools on purpose to test my patience. This task should not feel like getting feathers off a frog. Indeed, that is because I've been saving the best for last. You see, I thought to separate the wheat from the chaff, to make sure the brightest stars truly shine when presented. As Magnifico adjusted brass tubes and glass chambers, his eyes stopped scanning his notes, and he felt a pang of hope flutter in his chest, a rare emotion for a king who had endured so much. At Amaya's words, he straightened, folded his notes, then returned them to their place on a shelf. The best for last, you say? Then you should have brought them before me sooner. This has tested my tolerance, and I am more anxious than ever to make a selection, to find someone who understands, who might help to carry this burden. It is more than I can hope for. You must learn to have more patience. I was going to bring the most promising candidate before you tomorrow. At his wife's words, King Magnifico, who felt the universe rested on his shoulders, released a deep breath. Amaya, he said, I often wonder what I have done to deserve you. Thank you for everything you have done for me, and for Roses these last few days. And the prospect of something better to come at last made even the stars glow brighter for that moment. Chapter 3. A horrible disappointment. It was noon the following day, and Amaya had promised to return within the hour with the most promising candidate she'd been able to find. Magnifico waited in his wish chamber, a hidden chamber inside his observatory that stored every wish he'd been given, but never yet granted. He reached out so one of the wishes alighted on his finger. The wisp flickered, leaving a trail like sparks of hope in its wake. The king admired the aspiration, and the sense of longing it radiated made his heart ache, like a tune somebody used to know, then forgot, and heard once again in the distance. He let the wish, light as dandelion fluff, ascend into the swirling cloud of others above him, where they danced in a radiant sky revel, with stardust pirouettes and leaps. Magnifico knew from poetry that wishes weren't always what people should want, but rather, what they did want. They were mysterious flower buds, that would unfold and unfold, and might never stop unfolding, until the world was overrun with the complications of them, unless someone did something to stop their consequences. His people needed to trust his wisdom, for he'd spent the last 18 years studying the complexities of fate, and now recognized when the time was not right for a wish to unfold. The most challenging aspect of being a sorcerer was dealing with the unanswered wishes, because his subjects could fervently ask for something, believing it to be good and necessary, yet it was not always what was truly best for them. But why their wishes remained unanswered was a mystery to them. I opened Pandora's box by learning sorcery to grant wishes, but now I have a key, and can lock it up again when I need to, the king told himself, though he was never at peace despite the fact. But soon, he leaned against a windowsill. I will have someone to assist me, should anything go wrong. Amaya had told him the candidate's name, and assured him that this time, she had complete confidence in her abilities. What had she said the candidate's name was again? Gently, Magnifico traced the brass filigree of an old armillary sphere, its interlocking rings representing the orbits of celestial bodies. He studied its familiar patterns, remembering his own days as an apprentice, guided by his mentor's steady hand, and he listened to the faint, melodic hum of the wish's hopeful song. It filled him with peace. A jarring shriek pierced through their tune. Magnifico spun so fast his sphere toppled off its perch on the table. Someone is in my tower. Despite the horrific noise, the king made his expression calm, though a sinking sense of dread filled him as he feared for each delicate piece of equipment in his observatory. I suppose this is the best candidate Amaya could find, he thought sarcastically. I should never have allowed our meeting to take place here. What was Amaya thinking? Well, I've got to give them a chance. But as Magnifico emerged from his wish chamber, the picture was worse than the one his imagination had lent him. A young woman had stumbled in with the grace of a toddler, and attempted to make contact with his book of forbidden magic, evident from enchanted wasps encircling her, which he'd conjured as a safety precaution, to materialize if anyone but him touched the glass case protecting the manuscript. The girl swatted her arms like a wild monkey, continuing to shriek as the enchanted wasps buzzed in a menacing symphony around her, and Magnifico felt a wave of pity, because she thought they could sting when they were only meant to confuse and to scare. He'd almost raised his voice to yell, but the girl was turning pink, clearly embarrassed, and Amaya had thought her worthy of coming here. There could still be virtue underneath, in spite of this careless accident. He mustered patience. No, no, he laughed, making his presence known as he re-entered his observatory. Asha, is it? That book is forbidden. Though he hurried forward, he maintained a calm composure. Now hold still. I've got it. As he raised his hands to summon the swarm, he tried to make light of her mistake. You can't have known, but I put, a spell on the glass guarding this book. It is actually very, very dangerous. Dangerous? Then why would you have it? Asha, still waving her arms, sounded as if she was going to cry. I only wanted to touch the etchings around the glass because they were pretty. She was so worked up she slipped, and almost kicked King Magnifico in the face just as he'd gathered all the wasps into his hands. Before they could force their way from his grasp, he called up all the magic he could, and shot them back at the case, which they melted into, becoming nothing but ornate carvings, once again. Magnifico sighed as he shut the case, then he rubbed his hands off on his robes. A king must be prepared for everything. I hope there will never be a time this book needs to be used. Are you all right? No, said Asha, in what sounded like a whine. Magnifico was going to overlook this, but then Asha ploughed on in a show-offish sort of ramble. I mean yes. And I understand if you think I'm, totally weird and you want me to leave right now and never show my face again. That would certainly be for the best, thought Magnifico, but Amiya's words made him curious whether Asha actually had some mysterious talent not obvious at first sight. Let's not overreact, he said instead. You're here. You've certainly got my attention. He turned, and wriggled his fingers so a quill leapt into the air, ready to take notes on a bit of parchment he'd laid out on a desk. So go ahead. Tell me why you think you should be my apprentice. He waited with hope in his heart. Well, said Asha, in the tone of someone telling a joke to their friends, I care too much. Then she paused, as if waiting for a laugh. Okay, said Magnifico, as hope packed its bags and took a one-way trip from his heart. He waited for her to say something else, anything to imply she had some selfless intention, but she just continued staring, as if waiting for a reaction. That's interesting, said Magnifico finally. It's my weakness, she burst out, and looked so pleased with herself Magnifico thought she was going to laugh at her own incompetence. I see. Figured I might as well get through all the bad stuff right up front. She ruined her own joke by blabbering on too long. She was clearly used to being surrounded by a group of friends who laughed at everything she said, and was trying quite hard to be quirky. Fair enough. Magnifico already couldn't wait to send her away. This was not the way someone with common sense acted before the king. It reminded him far too much of 18 years earlier, when no one had shown him any respect. But he would get through the rest of the interview for Amiya's sake. He breathed out. And your strengths? Do you have any? Glad you asked. I have many. Asha brushed her box braids behind her ear, then pulled a vellum book from her pocket. I'm a hard worker, and I help well, and I'm young and malleable, and I like to draw. Magnifico grasped for something in all these cliches. You like to draw. He latched onto the most useful of these irrelevant skills. And how long have you had this ability? At this, the first glimpse of sincerity appeared in Asha's eyes, and she opened her book to detailed life gestures she'd sketched of goats and lambs. A long time. She flipped through more pages of life-like scribbles. It's something my father taught me, she told the king with a proud smile. When Asha said this, a distant, half-forgotten memory stirred inside Magnifico, and he peered closer at the young woman's annoying face. I think I remember your father. You do. He was a philosopher, was he not? Had great magic running through his blood. Always warning people about the consequences of getting whatever your heart desires. Asha's eyes glazed over at the last part, but she eagerly started talking about herself again. Oh yeah. We used to climb that tree by the high ridge in the hamlet, where I'm from, to look at the stars, and he said they were there to guide us. Your father said a lot more than soft soap like that. He was a very wise man. Did you learn much about his philosophies? Not really. After he got struck by lightning, he wasn't able to take me out at night as much anymore. I used to want to make a wish that he would get better, but the electric shock left him with lots of burns, and his heart finally stopped one day. I'm sorry. How old were you when he passed away? I was 12 years old. Magnifico finally glimpsed something recognizable in Asha, so he attempted to dig a bit deeper. It's not fair, is it? He asked, taking a gamble as he searched her face for that sincerity again. When I was young, I too suffered great loss. He wasn't sure Asha would pay attention, as the subject changed to something other than herself, but he went on, determined to finish, because whether she listened at this moment would decide everything. Years ago, my entire family was killed by selfish, greedy thieves, and their lands were reduced to ashes, he told her. The devastation was beyond imagining. The streets, once bustling with life, were strewn with the bodies of those I once loved. Though the village I roamed was silent, I could still hear sobbing of ghosts, of my mother and my father, my brothers and sisters, and my friends. Not a day passes without the haunting thought, if only I had known sorcery then. The king shuddered as the faces of his lost kin grew clear in his memories. He looked hard into Asha's eyes. It is for this reason, Asha, that the very foundation of this kingdom is built upon the belief that no one should ever experience the agony of watching their dreams crumble before their eyes. I vowed to create a haven where everyone would be safe, where the horrors of my past would never befall another. Magnifico paused to see whether she was listening. Asha had finally stopped rocking back and forth, and looked contemplative. When the king stopped talking, she blinked. You're right, she managed. No one should live their life feeling the pain of that loss every day. The king nodded. Yes, exactly. And that is why I do what I do. Asha's voice was serious when she replied, and that's why I want to work for you. Perhaps it was his imagination, or his own good heart deceiving him, but at that moment, Magnifico was overwhelmed, and his heart melted a little. Come with me, he said, and led Asha toward the tower's back wall, where he raised an arm so the stones shifted and slid apart, and his wish chamber revealed itself. Wow, said Asha as blue light poured over her, and the domed chamber shone upon her in all its heavenly glory. You're one of the few I've ever invited in here. Magnifico led her inside with sweeping strides. But if I am to trust you, I need you to understand just how important the wishes of roses are. He glanced at his guest, and was pleased to see her expression was properly impressed, her eyes wide, and her mouth shut. You can feel them, can't you? I can, she whispered. They're, everything. That's exactly it. These wishes are everything. Magnifico paused to let her take in the brilliance of them. I didn't expect them to feel so alive. Asha reached out toward the tangible essence of someone's deepest aspiration, a woman cradling a violin in her arms inside the orb. She shivered as the woman created the beautiful music of someone who'd put in countless hours of practice, each pluck of a string evoking a yearning that transcended the material world around them. Magnifico laughed a deep laugh at Asha's first impression. They fill you with so much longing, don't they? But that one would do no good to grant. Ambition untempered by effort stifles the growth of character. Denying someone the trials and triumphs of their journey robs them of the refinement of their soul. To grow in virtue is to become something more beautiful than even the most vibrant vibrations of violin strings. Asha didn't respond, so mesmerized was she by the spectacle. Magnifico sighed a weary sigh as they stood gazing. People often mistake wishes for mere ideas. He put a hand to his heart. But that's wrong. They are a part of your soul, the very purpose for which it was made. Each one inspires me anew, even after all the years I have protected them. And that is what I will do until the day that I die. I will protect each of these wishes at all costs. Oh, wow, said Asha again. That's pretty confusing. I could never explain this to anyone even if I wanted to. She had begun fiddling with her braids again. Wishes aren't really for words. Magnifico furrowed his brow, for Asha and her awkward rambling clashed discordantly with the solemnity of the room. But he softened his gaze as he hastened to conclude the interview. Asha, our time together has been most enlightening. Now, it is time for us to part ways. Allow me to escort you from my tower. But Asha was no longer listening. Her gaze shifted, resting upon something on the chamber's opposite side. Asha, you must listen to me. Magnifico stepped forward, realizing his mistake, and he wondered why he had thought for a moment this time would be different from all the others. Asha, fixated on her desire, oblivious to anything else once she had spotted it, sprinted ruthlessly forward, disrupting the wish's delicate dance with impatient sweeps that made their light refract and ripple so even the tower's walls trembled with their frantic flickering. "Oh!" she gasped as she staggered toward it. Magnifico's entire being sagged with profound weariness. "Asha," he implored, knowing well all was lost now. Again he took a step forward, understanding the spell would never be broken. Asha reached the wish, then stood motionless, clutching it, her back toward the king, her eyes locked onto it, no doubt glowing with its radiance, and she would not take them off again. "It's my Savasabino's wish," she whispered, hardly breathing. Magnifico took another step toward the girl in the trance. "It is my doing," he thought. "It is my fault for being such a fool. It's his birthday today." Asha's voice was on the edge of song, imbued with wanting, a quality Magnifico had heard time after time. It was always someone's birthday. "He's turning 100 years old this day." Magnifico leaned forward, careful not to startle her, and said delicately, "That is impressive." He moved to pry the wish away gently, attempting to free her from its spell. But the girl, whom he'd had no reason to believe would prove different than countless others, held it away, looked up, and said not unsurprisingly, yet still to his thorough disappointment, "Would you, maybe, possibly, consider granting this wish tonight?" The wish's chaotic flickering dimmed, and Magnifico's face darkened. Suddenly, the coldness of the night sky's boundless expanse seeped into the tower, and became palpable. "Well, that was fast, wasn't it?" Magnifico began talking to himself, rather than to his guest, and his breathing became increasingly rapid and flustered as he realized he had invited a simpleton into his guarded, sacred wish chamber. You know, his patience drained away, and he felt the sudden need to sit down. "Most people wait a few months, even a year before they start asking me for things." He turned away, hoping the girl would have the sense to see herself out. Asha, broken from her daze, finally gathered the self-awareness to stutter, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to say something so thoughtless right away." "It's all right." Magnifico knew he could not blame the girl for his poor judgment. "Here." He extended a hand, more for his own understanding than Asha's. "Let me see what it is your Savasabino would wish for." Asha reluctantly handed the wish to Magnifico, who raised it up to his gaze, and he squinted to examine just what was inside its misty murmurs. Inside twinkled the image of a tree, underneath which a group of young people were gathered around a bent-old figure playing a well-worn lute. Its chord seemed to be casting a melodic spell over its audience, inspiring them to sway back and forth, bending to its will. Magnifico could not tell what the scene was supposed to imply. "It is a beautiful wish," he said out of politeness. "But unfortunately, it is too dangerous." "Dangerous?" blurted Asha, and she reached out to try to grab it back. King Magnifico lifted it from her reach. "It looks as though your Savasabino longs to create something to inspire the next generation. A noble desire, but very vague, not thought through to any conclusion I am able to consider." "Create what? A rebellious mob, perhaps?" He thought back to the shameless peasant who'd demanded absolute power years ago. "Unfortunately, there is no way to know. And any wayward wish has potential to destroy roses, even unintentionally." Asha, meanwhile, was turning a bright shade of red. "My Saba would never do anything to hurt anyone." She put a hand to her heart dramatically, unable to grasp the nuances of this explanation. "My Saba is good, not bad. I know that." Magnifico sighed, and once more, gave her words unearned justification. "Well, you're young. You don't know anything, really, whereas it is my responsibility to only grant the wishes I am sure are good for roses." Asha spluttered, and her eyes moved about the chamber, her face twisted into the expression of a child who had candy taken away at the last second. "Then what exactly are you saying?" She scrunched her face further. "That most of these wishes will never be granted. Yet I will still protect them like all the others. You have nothing to fear." Magnifico kept his back to the disrespectful peasant, and busied himself at his flasks and beakers, expecting her to escort herself out any moment. "Can't you just give them back instead?" "Excuse me?" Magnifico's head turned back. "You could just give the wishes you're not going to grant back. Then, I mean, like, if they're dangerous, You can just stop them. How hard can it be? Magnifico spun around. You've completely missed the point. People make wishes because they need guidance. The journey will be hard, and they will even think it unfair, but it will be what is best for them in the end. They willingly surrender their wishes to me, and I protect them until the time is right. It is not an easy task, and requires considerable discernment and wisdom. You make it so they forget their deepest desires. So how are they even supposed to know what they are missing? Magnifico didn't think he should waste any more words on this girl who insisted on seeing things in black and white. It is no bad thing to forget about something you can never have, he said, easing the doubt he'd had himself. Amaya had been so sure this was prudent. If the time becomes right, you will remember your deepest desire when it comes to pass. Many fulfill their own destiny without interference. But what about the wishes you're never going to grant? There are many I will never grant, because they are good for no one. The girl widened her eyes, and she looked ready to shout propaganda at the top of her lungs, to spread unrest throughout the kingdom until she got her way. Now I know your secret. Her lip trembled, then she put her foot down. It's not fair. My Saba is good, and the people of Roses are good. They deserve to have every whim satisfied. She stepped toward one of the wishes, arms outstretched for it. Enough. Magnifico stepped forward with commanding grace, garments billowing, creating a barrier to shield the wishes from the path she sought. I grant the wishes. He stared imperiously down at her. Asha faltered backwards, but she glared back at the king with a defiant scowl for a fleeting flash. One of the observatory doors hesitantly creaked open. My king, called Amaya, I am sorry to interrupt, but the time is upon us once again for the wish-granting ceremony to begin. Magnifico slowly shifted his gaze from the staring match he was engaged in, toward the doors and his wife. Then he said with measured calmness, "Is it, my love?" And, not dignifying the young woman with any more insight she would continue to misrepresent, he strode toward the welcome distraction. He said, pausing on his way, and he glanced back at Tasha. Amaya, why don't you see Tasha with you on the main stage? No, that's okay. Asha was finally eager to leave. I don't want to sit through the whole wish ceremony. I already know you're not going to grant the wish I care about. Magnifico smiled at her. I insist, he said. Perhaps if you witness the hardships of my job, you will come to appreciate the burden of it. Chapter 4, The Ceremony. Magnifico kept his shoulders back and head held high as he stepped through his castle's arched entranceway, into the grand, circular courtyard's expanse, onto the stage where he'd face his hardest task as king, choosing one person's deepest desire out of the thousands of tear-wet, expectant faces peering back up at him. He announced himself to the sea of breathless souls by casting spells with sweeping gestures. With each wave of a hand, radiant, variegated star showers unfurled through the air that transformed into delicate butterflies, and gasps of awe rippled through the courtyard as they left trails of sparkling hope behind them that rained down gently, in the king's attempt to raise spirits before he would, inevitably, leave some of them broken-hearted, their sobs destined to disturb his dreams for years to come. Magnifico's voice, amplified by a spell, echoed across the courtyard. My dear subjects. He raised his arms as if to embrace. On this enchanting night, as the stars illuminate our beloved kingdom, it is not only good to see you, but also an honor to be seen by you. I am deeply moved by the sight of all of you gathered here. Your presence brings warmth to my heart, and a profound sense of gratitude. In your faces, I find the strength and resilience that define our people, and it is your unwavering spirit that guides me in all I do. Cheers rose to a crescendo, and tears glistened in the eyes of each person as they applauded the king who had brought them peace for nearly 2 decades. Magnifico's gaze shifted to his wife, who had just taken her place on the main stage, and brought Asha with her as instructed. He gratefully nodded toward her, then turned back to the crowd. Now, we shall begin with a matter that concerns the heart and soul of our kingdom. We have 2 new citizens ready to give their wishes. Helena, Esteban, you are going to be very happy here, I promise you. He extended a hand to welcome his new subjects who'd sailed from across the sea onto the stage. The couple, still so young as to be untarnished by the joys and trials of parenthood, climbed the stairs to the stage. Magnifico looked into the eyes of the future of Roses, and took the young woman's hand into his own first. Now make a wish, and hold it in your heart. The woman closed her eyes, then opened her hand in the sorcerer's, so they both began to glow. Her breathing relaxed as a terrible weight evaporated from her consciousness, and her wish materialized in her palm in the form of a glowing orb. Her husband did the same in Magnifico's other hand. The king swept both wishes toward his chest. It unburdens the soul, does it not? Then he raised his arms so the wishes ascended into the sky, where they floated to join the others at the top of his tower. He smiled upon the husband and wife. Perhaps I will stand here and make them realities one day. The man and woman smiled, and left the stage with a new spring in their steps, as if lighter than before. Once again, Magnifico turned toward the place Amaya sat, and searched for signs on the face of the young woman next to her of understanding or empathy. Surely she'd grasped the weight of his ceremonial words, and the sacrifices they represented. But the young woman's eyes were clouded, and her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her garment. She looked unmoved and unchanged. Magnifico exhaled sharply, then turned back to his audience. Thank you for your applause. Tonight, it brings me great joy to welcome these two new souls into our realm. They have passed through my eclipse enclosure, a barrier few are granted to cross. This shield is also a testament to the trust I place in those who enter. Not everyone finds their way through my curtain of star silt, yet here they stand, embraced by the safety I've woven. May their presence enrich our land as we share in the journey ahead. The king waited as a roar of applause rose and fell, and he knew this was the real moment everyone had been waiting for. He released a final cascade of light from his fingertips that arched across the heavens in a concluding streak. Now then, who is ready to have their wish granted? The crowd's thunderous reaction was like a storm breaking out, as each person brought to mind their unique wish for a brighter dawn, and Magnifico knew that if witnessing this collective flame, igniting every heart, not solely your own, was not enough to stir someone, they must be beyond redemption in their selfishness. For the last month, the king had sweated blood and tears discerning which wish he should choose, and deciding was no easier a task than it was any other ceremony. The wish had to be something genuinely harmless, yet selfless enough to make Roses a better place. Wishes like this were surprisingly few and far between, as most people were not selfless, or wanted to twist fate too drastically. When he came across one that was selfless, but too drastic, his eyes often overflowed with sorrow at a young girl watching her mother die from illness, or a farmer whose crop had failed, who had lost everything he loved. It has been a challenge for me to make a final decision today, he said without betraying emotion, and it is with clarity and an open heart full of love that I grant today's wish to someone who has very patiently waited long enough. Eyes were wide, breaths were bated, and the courtyard was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Sania Osman, said Magnifico. Step forward now. There were gasps and murmurs, and the crowd slowly parted to reveal a young lass with burning joy on her face. Is it really me? She came forward, swaying as if she would faint. What have I done to deserve it? Can this actually be? She was helped onto the stage by those around her when she threatened to fall off her feet. Magnifico outstretched an arm to help her up. I mean it when I say, it truly is my great pleasure to grant your heart's desire, to sew the most beautiful dresses in all the land. It is a rare and noble heart that seeks to bring beauty and joy to others with such selfless devotion. In the background, Asha was clenching her fists as if ready to throw a fit. Never, ever get your hopes up. A sarcastic whisper came from a clique of teenagers lounging at the courtyard's side. Their whispers and stifled laughs sliced through the solemn silence, drawing disapproving glances. To crown it all, one of them wiped his nose disrespectfully on his sleeve in front of everyone. Magnifico thought he'd seen some of the teenagers in this group around before, acting as tour guides of Roses. Only wealthy teens volunteered for this position, as it was unpaid, which only worked out if your parents already paid for everything. Tour guides often became well known and popular. If Asha was part of this clique, she was clearly in no desperate need of a position in his court. One towering figure stood out from the group, larger and more sluggish than the rest. He slouched against a pillar, his head drooping as he struggled to keep his eyes open. Every now and then, he rubbed his face with a heavy hand. While the others snickered and fidgeted, he remained a silent observer, his melancholic gaze unsettling in its seriousness. The king bowed to conclude the ceremony, and there was a final round of applause. Then he turned back to his guest. Asha, obviously I will not be offering you the position as my apprentice. Magnifico smiled. But don't worry, I will still protect your Sabasivana's wish at all costs. Then he spun on his heel, and departed the stage, hoping most sincerely never to see the girl again. Chapter 5. A Mysterious Light. That night, the king did the same thing he did after every wish ceremony, and sought solace in his observatory to avoid those who felt badly done by, and because he could not face their tears. How I long for simpler times, he said to himself, when my only concern was learning the names of stars. He remembered a peasant who'd once told him he was so devastated at his chance to have his wish granted being pulled out from under him, that after the ceremony, he could not whistle again for a whole week. The king moved to a nearby shelf lined with books, and pulled out a weathered volume, its spine cracked and pages yellowed. He flipped through its diagrams and notes, seeking to distract himself, before his gaze wandered to an ornate clock on the wall, its hands ticking steadily. Midnight, he realized, in just a few seconds. It is still very early in the night. He shut the book, and no sooner had he lifted it to put it back on the shelf, than a blinding light cracked across the sky, and the hopeful hum of the wishes ceased inside his wish chamber. What? Magnifico burst into the chamber. No, it cannot be. He found the wishes quaking like leaves, not dancing, but dimming, and some even rolled across the floor like mere balls of pigskin. No warm glow greeted him, and the air in the chamber hung cold around him. What has happened here? He rushed to the room's center, gazing up at the terrible sight. My king. Amaya slithered in beside him, seemingly from nowhere. Rather than acknowledge the display, she said distractedly, "You spoil us with your magic." Whatever that blinding light was moments ago, it was marvelous. I summoned no light. What are you talking about? That light affected my wishes. Is it some sort of warning? The king's grip tightened on the book he'd forgotten to set down. I believe I have just been threatened. He felt as if a candle's warmth had been extinguished in the depths of his soul. Amaya let out a little gasp, and put a hand to her heart. For heaven's sake, who would dare threaten you? Can you think of no one who would want to command authority over my people's wishes? Magnifico spun toward his wife. I have been threatened many times, but not these last 18 years. My defenses are not working. I am in no mood for this. The time has come to strengthen protection again. I will do my duty to protect the wishes from anything that seeks to destroy the balance of them. A strange sparkle glinted in Amiya's eye, and she said calmly, keeping the balance is most important. One wouldn't want a civil war, and the people of Roses might consider anything that upsets their deepest desires to be a personal matter. They may even hold you responsible, and seek treason. Magnifico stormed out of his chamber, back into the observatory, for Amaya was not being her helpful self, and she made the weight growing in his chest all the heavier. He sought to clear his mind by moving out onto the observation deck, but tonight, from its railing, the sky was mysterious and black rather than a light and comforting. He fell back, startled to see a piercing through his vial's dark shroud, where a thin strip of white light poured through it, as slender as spudder's thread and piercing as a needle. It had skewered itself with unerring precision. A cold hand touched the back of his neck. My king, all will be well. Amaya appeared from behind again. We will unravel this mystery as we have met every challenge before this, together. This time, Magnifico found it harder to look up into her eyes, but finally he managed. You speak truly. Once again, I am ever grateful for your counsel. My dear, dear wife, in whom I place my deepest trust. It is a great comfort to know that through any trial, you will always be there to offer your support. Indeed. Amaya nearly laughed, but stopped herself. Then she said most seriously, we will solve this mystery, and Roses will be better off for it once it has been resolved. Then she departed the tower, leaving the king, weighed down by worry, alone in shadows of doubt. Chapter 6. Betrayed. The next day, there was a great shuffling and clumping as every citizen drew together in the king's courtyard for the second time that month. The air was heavy with unspoken fears. Even the seabirds who nested between the courtyard's great columns were disturbed, and flapped and fluttered through the crowd of people, who had to swat them away as they squawked. As King Magnifico marched out onto the stage, his presence did not silence the murmurs, nor calm the restless stirring as usual. Let silence reign. Magnifico used the same spell to magically magnify his voice, finally causing the whispering to cease. He stepped forward, and projected more loudly, I know you're all wondering about the blinding light last night. A light I did not command or condone. Gasps echoed all around at this confirmation of suspicions. It was magic, an art perilous to tamper with, yet executed with clumsiness and amateur ineptitude, and it breached my eclipse enclosure. It was also forbidden by law. There is a traitor amongst us, who used sorcery to put you all at risk. The whispers began again, and a great seabird cried to join the pity. Do not worry. Magnifico stood tall. They stand no chance against my power. Rest assured, once apprehended, they will face the full measure of justice. Yet our greater concern is the well-being of our kingdom. Roses needs you now more than ever. Any information about the traitor would be most helpful. I know you will not let me down in this, and I thank you all from the bottom of my heart once again." Magnifico bowed, and moved to step down from the stage to conclude the assembly. "Your Majesty, wait," rasped a voice from his sea of subjects, so Magnifico turned his head back. "Please." The king approached the outspoken peasant with earnest expectation. "Have you any information to offer?" Heh. Ahem. Okay." Magnifico's eyes lingered on the peasant's crutch, and he saw it was the bespectacled girl from the disruptive gang of teenagers who'd complained loudly during his wish ceremony the night before. He closed his eyes. "I've no time for this," he thought, but any clue was of grave importance, so he made himself smile warmly in case she was being genuine. Hi. I'm Dahlia." The girl had the same accent Asha had, of one who never took a thing seriously, even when lives were at stake. "I make your Magnifico cookies." She held up a cookie shaped like the king's head as if it were relevant. "Fantastic. What can I do for you, Dahlia?" "Oh, thank you for asking. Well, you said any information would be helpful. But pragmatically speaking, what qualifies?" In Magnifico's view, it was a 50-50 chance the peasant was truly stupid, or she was making another joke. The latter would have been at so inappropriate a time, he gave her the grace of assuming she was an idiot. Evidentiary. She was still going on. "How about circumstantial? First hand? Second hand? What about hunches? Any information about who or what caused the terrible light would be most helpful. Lives could be saved." The peasant didn't even have the decency to look concerned about this, and changed the subject. "You said it was amateur magic, but then how come you don't know how they did it?" "What? Perhaps you could define amateur." Magnifico gave the peasant a stern look. "This is about your safety, as well as the safety of others, and even your wishes could be at stake. Do you find it necessary to waste my time with irrelevant questions?" Do you mean our wishes aren't safe?" The peasant stared blankly back. "Yeah," she got another listening subject to join in. "How do we know our wishes are safe? We never see them." "Why can't we see them?" Another got involved. "Why is that a rule?" The bespectacled girl looked pleased she had caused unrest. She put her free hand to her hip. "And why can't we remember them?" Magnifico addressed the crowd, placing a hand on his chest as if making a solemn vow. "I understand your concern. It is difficult to have faith. But as seeds grow beneath the soil before they bloom, your wishes are nurtured and protected. Their fulfillment may not be immediate, but they are tended with utmost care and dedication." Another teenager from the wayward gang, tall and dopey, wearing a green tunic, said as if he hadn't even listened, "Since we're asking, what if we want to change our wish?" "Good point. Wishes can change." He got someone else to interject. "You know what'd comfort us?" called another subject. "Another wish ceremony." "Yeah. It would make us all feel so much better." "Please, your Majesty. We could do it now." Dahlia pumped a fist in the air. "Let's form a line, and everyone will get a turn to have their wish granted." As the crowd's excitement grew, a figure emerged from the shadows near the edge of the gathering. The tall, tired teenager who'd been with the gang at the ceremony approached his friends with unnatural quietness, too sluggish to join in. Before Magnifico could utter another word, his subjects were chanting, "Wishes, wishes, where's our share? We're done waiting, it's only fair. Wishes, wishes, give them here, we want them now, let's make it clear." Silence. Magnifico's voice sliced through the noise as he raised his hand, palm open, and he stared fiercely at the crowd. "Is that all you can think about in the midst of dire circumstances? A wish-granting ceremony?" A jester nodded, the bells on her fool's cap tinkling. The courtyard swayed in the king's vision as frustration finally filled him. He breathed in and out to try and calm himself. "Fine," he said eventually, with great reluctance and disappointment in his heart at his subjects' selfishness. "Then hear this. Whoever identifies the traitor, your wish will be granted. But let it be known that anyone who helps the traitor, anyone who lets me down, your wish shall never be granted." As he turned to leave, the crowd erupted behind him with excited exchanges of opinions. "Wait," the crippled peasant had the audacity to try to continue. "Your Majesty, enough." King Magnifico disappeared through his castle's doors that thundered shut behind him. "How brazenly they question me." The king spun on Amaya, who stood waiting for him in the entrance hall. "I will be in my tower with the wishes. Disturb me with nothing but good news." He pushed a decorative suit of armor out of his path with a startling clang, then began climbing his tower's steps. Each one was a reminder of his isolation. His thoughts were filled with the faces of his subjects and their endless requests, for he could recall every one of their troubles, hopes, and fears, yet no one had ever asked him a question about himself in his whole life. It is in people's nature to think of themselves first. Magnifico paused to grip the banister, and gazed out a stained glass window. Who can fault them for this? I chose to bear this burden when I took the throne. He knew very well that if he said, "How are you?" the typical response would be, "Oh, Your Majesty, you wouldn't believe the troubles I've faced. Just yesterday, my only pot cracked while I was trying to boil water, so I had to borrow my neighbour's pot, but on the way back, I tripped over a loose cobblestone, and spilled all the water. Then, when I finally got the fire going again, it started to rain, and my roof leaked, putting out the fire entirely. Honestly, it feels as though the entire world conspires against me, and it would be clear that the person he was talking to needed a new pot. People are driven by self-interest." He moved away from the banister. It is natural. They are all the same underneath. But he realized he had a contradictory belief. A memory surfaced from his childhood of a courtyard, now ruined, where once grand fountains were buried under decades of dust and debris. Long ago, when he was a boy, an old woman had always sat by the village well there, and he had decided to sit next to her every morning. The old woman had talked to him about her life, her childhood, her family, her joys and sorrows, and Magnifico had listened, rarely speaking, until one day the old woman finally turned to him and said, "You're my friend," despite his silence. "You listen to me like no one else does," she'd said, and in that moment, Magnifico realized listening was more important than talking. He learned that through acts of selflessness, meaningful differences could be made in the lives of others. Yet, whoever listened to him? As Magnifico reached the top of the stairs, he noticed a delicate flower arrangement a servant had carefully placed in a vase inside an alcove. Underneath the vase, the yellow corner of parchment stuck out at an obvious angle, as if waiting to be found. "What is this?" The king slid it out from under the vase, and a list unrolled, long as an arm, with the contents of one sending requests to the North Pole the night before Christmas. In a swift motion, Magnifico swept the vase off the ledge. Petals scattered as it shattered on the floor, and the crash echoed across the hall. He stared at the pieces glistening across the marble, feeling a strange satisfaction in their brokenness. As he stared into the shards, he recognized the vase had been the gift from her, his wife, the queen. Amaya, at least sometimes, paused to listen to him. After his whole life had been a series of giving, protecting, and serving, only she knew that his favorite color was purple. In her presence, he found a small acknowledgement that his thoughts mattered to someone, even if only now and then. Magnifico wrenched open the door to his observatory, still breathing unevenly. "I've given everything I have, and all I've asked for is a little respect." He still faced the doors, unable to take his eyes off the broken vase in the hall. "Do my subjects think their lives are unfair? Without me, it wouldn't exist." His lips twisted, as if tasting something bitter, their chant echoing in his mind. "You'd think I neglect them. Would they walk a mile in my shoes?" He let out a soundless, unamused chuckle. "Well, I am exhausted by all my efforts. And this is the gratitude I receive." He watched a frightened servant in the hallway come to sweep up the mess, then he snapped the doors to his observatory shut. When Magnifico turned around, the picture that greeted him made him clutch his chest and stagger backward. Singed papers fluttered across the floor, their edges curling and blackening as they burned slowly, and splintered shelves lay on their sides, their contents strewn across the room. Shattered glass vials, the liquid they once contained now sullen puddles of silver and gold, and books with charred spines formed a grim scene amidst choking smoke. A large section of the room was a smouldering ruin, with little flames dancing over piles of ash, consuming decades worth of meticulously organized notes and priceless, leather-bound books. Amid this wreckage, a single book remained, encased in its protective case, miraculously untouched by the flames, its cover still gleaming. Magnifico stared at the remnants open-mouthed, his fists clenching and unclenching. The air around him smouldered as he moved disbelievingly across the room. A sharp knock at the door broke the silence. "Who dares?" A guard stepped into the room. "Your Majesty, someone has come forward with news about the traitor." The words hit Magnifico with a jolt, and he ran to the guard before even rescuing any of his burning legacy. "Bring them to the throne room at once, and order every servant to my tower to save what they can from this mess. The traitor has been inside my observatory. Enough is enough." The guard stood in stunned silence for a moment, taking in the scene. Then he, too, hurried after the king, down the tower's steps. Magnifico was pacing back and forth in his throne room when the large, sluggish teenager from the wayward gang stepped in, his face, vague and witless before, now taut with urgency, as his eyes, barely visible under his hat's brim, took in the grandness of the room. "You bring news about the traitor." Magnifico turned to him when the door creaked. "Asha," the young man declared, taking his hat into his hands and squashing it as his knees shook. "She breached the eclipse enclosure by summoning a star. We must act now." Though a stab of annoyance pierced Magnifico's heart at information concerning that bothersome brat, he only strode forward to put a hand on the young man's shoulder. "What is your name?" he asked. "You have done well in informing me of this." "Simon." The teenager blinked. "Simon, is there anything else you can tell me about this girl? Any information about her background at all?" "Yeah. She was really upset when you wouldn't grant her wish. Said she was sneaking into your tower to steal it, so she could make it come true herself. Said she wouldn't rest until she'd started a civil war, and everyone got their wishes granted." "And what of this war? Do you know anything of her plans?" "She wants to spread as much unrest as possible. She's trying to learn magic so she can take you on, but she isn't very good, even though she has got some magic in her blood. That's why she summoned a wishing star. She said it's her secret weapon." "I see. Wishing stars are not to be trifled with. They are a secret brotherhood about which almost nothing is known. They are also called nightlights, guardians of magic, allies to the man in the moon. Though they help illuminate the night and guide lost souls, they have interests of their own, different from those of humans, and may not use their magic wisely." Simon stared back blankly. "Simon, you will have your wish granted before the next new moon, as you justly deserve for exposing the traitor." The king spun to one of his servants walking past with a pile of wreckage from the tower in her arms. "Prepare the carriage. We leave for the hamlet at once." As Magnifico readied himself for departure, Asha's smug face haunted his thoughts, and as he contemplated her carelessness, the stability of his kingdom teetering on the edge, he looked more and more forward to their looming confrontation. Chapter 7. The Duel. The hamlet, a mossy place secluded by forest, where inhabitants made bread from pinecone flour, and kept more chickens than charts or charms, came into view. The moon cast it in sharp-edged shadows as Magnifico readied his staff, murmuring last incantations over it. Before leaving the castle, he'd imbued it with extra power from the night sky, using a spell from his only remaining book, the one he'd been reluctant to use because of its relation to dark sorcery. Desperate times call for desperate measures, he told himself, though he'd immediately locked the book away again after referencing this spell. He thought mournfully of the rest of his destroyed resources, original manuscripts he'd compiled, containing centuries of study by other sorcerers. "Now I have no idea what a star might be capable of." He caressed his staff's fine point that could stab if needed. "The hour has come." The carriage silently rolled to a stop behind a towering oak thick as a dragon's tail, just on the hollow's edge. Magnifico looked to the driver and raised a finger to his lips, then motioned for him to drive away unseen. As he stepped out into the hamlet, and the crunch of leaves, which set a carpet of gold beneath his boots, was concealed by ceaseless clucking as chickens talked in their sleep inside their roosts. The hollow's modest shielings, stone houses shaped like mushroom caps, unadorned except by moss or the occasional clothesline, stood huddled close together, intertwined with roots of trees for protection. The humble hollow did not look like the kind of place to hide a criminal. The king held his staff before him to light the way as he crept between the shieling huts and oaks tall as mountains. As he stepped over a root as thick as one of the castle's pillars, his foot landed on a pinecone, and he clasped a hand over his mouth when he nearly screamed. Just as he approached the center of the cluster of homes, the staff began humming faintly, its sound growing in intensity. As the king crept, the staff's hum shifted in pitch, resonating with a particularly small shieling hut which he paused in front of. He noted a faint glow seeping through its rough, timber-framed windows, and the murmur of voices within. Even muffled by stone walls, self-satisfied pauses emanated. It was the girl showing off. He knew that. Without hesitation, Magnifico raised his staff, then forced the door open with a bang. The conversation stopped abruptly as Ash's gaze met his, the recognition in her eyes confirming what the staff already indicated. Its sharp end was pointed up at the star hovering inches below the Aesons. "What folly is this?" "It isn't folly at all. It's simply glorious." The star did a somersault in the air. He was a flicker of ghost fire in the form of a young man. Clad in changing hues of white, topaz, and misty red, his clothes echoed the night sky. His bright eyes held glints of mischief, and moving with grace. His cape trailed sparks behind him as he flew in and out the asins, twisted a picture frame, peeked into a drawer, then sent a stack of books tumbling from a shelf, as if dropping stones from the sky. The playful spirit who'd come down from the heavens laughed, each note twinkling like a warning sign. The star continued doing flips in the air as he addressed the king. "You see, mighty king, with a crown shining bright, the stars in the heavens dance all through the night. They laugh at your trials, they chuckle with glee, as they dance in the moonlight, wild and free. They meddle for fun, oh, but fret not dear king, for your country will fall, but it's a burdensome thing." Asha laughed, and though she had a hand over her mouth, she looked impressed. "Star boy," she said. Magnifico's eyes blazed as he raised his staff, and he unleashed a striking green beam that cut through the air. Star boy, now idly twirling a ribbon of stardust around his finger, tried to dodge, but was struck directly in the heart, and like a mosquito swatted, fell to the ground with an expression of stunned surprise. His stardust trail dim and scattered. From the floor he looked up at Magnifico, shaking off the remnants of the spell's green glow. "All right, you've got me, you've proven your might. I underestimated you, and I've lost the fight." He grinned, then added, "But watch your step, king, as you tread. Anger the stars and you'll find yourself dead." Magnifico's staff crackled again, and he struck at Starboy with a wave of green fire. The house's beams groaned under the strain of magic, and shards of stone rained down. Starboy darted around, a streak of incomprehensible light, and he paused only to withdraw something from his pocket, a slim, pale stick he tossed down to Asha. "Take this wand, a gift from the heavens. You're a fairy godmother now, my dear." "Aye." Asha let out an excited screech as she caught it. The wand was swiftly knocked from her hand by a wave of Magnifico's staff. "You are both banished from the realm for threatening my kingdom." He raised it again, when Starboy, hovering just out of reach, laughed as he conjured a torrent of fire, and flames lashed out from his palms, catching Magnifico's cloak in a dance of light and heat. Asha scurried forward to her wand, and brandished it as he stomped on the flames. With a quick flick, she sent a stream of light to blind the king. The spell struck his eyes in a burst of bright sparks, so he staggered back. He growled as he struggled to regain control. Starboy swooped down, his laughter ringing out. "Not so great and grand now are we. Your fat is as clear as it can be." He sent another wave of fire towards the king that collided with a flash from the staff, and the force caused an explosion in the air that ripped the house apart. The blast hurled its occupants onto the hamlet's muddy, leaf-strewn ground with violent force. Heavy debris and fragments of shattered furniture rained down over them, crashing into the ground and scattering in all directions. Asha crawled out from the rubble. "Even the stars want you dead," she cried. Her wand was still clenched in her fist, pointed at the king. With one final, powerful blast from both the staff and the wand, Magnifico's staff was driven back. He stumbled, his robe scorched and smeared with dark, burned patches. His face was marked with red streaks where flames had seared his skin. The pain made his jaw clench, and he dropped his staff, its once glittering wood now singed and cracked. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, and his shoulders drooped in defeat. He cast one last, reluctant glance at Starboy and Asha before he turned away, his steps heavy and slow as he headed back toward his castle, leaving the hollow in silence. His retreating figure cast a long shadow in the night. Magnifico limped back to his castle, his robes charred and his once proud stance broken. The burns on his face throbbed. He had faced many threats before, but this was different. The wand Asha wielded, guided by Starboy's unpredictable influence, was a danger he'd never anticipated. It was magic with no regard for consequence, and a threat to everything he'd worked for. His next move required careful planning. In the shadowed corridors of the castle, he found Amaya waiting. Her expression, once warm and reassuring, was tainted by a nose wrinkled ever so slightly. "You look defeated, my king," she said. "These two reckless children aim to destroy everything with their inept magic. They'll tear this kingdom apart before they even understand what they've done. They are only children. They have no control, and no respect for what they wield. If they strike again, who knows how they will endanger everyone. Their magic threatens everything we've worked for." Magnifico stormed up the steps to his tower, Amaya scurrying after him. Though the tower's bookshelves and tables were empty now, the ashes from the king's destroyed possessions had been swept away, and the servants had left the room shiny as a shilling. "You're right to be concerned." Amaya fell through the doors. "But you are the king. You have the means to end this. You just need to use them." Magnifico turned to her. What are you suggesting? Amaya stepped closer. The forbidden book, she whispered, and her tone was enticing. You already used it once to create the staff, and it is the only resource you have left now. It holds the power you need. If you could harness its magic, you could stop Asha and Starboy before they bring us all to ruin. That magic was sealed away for a reason. I should not have used it to create the staff, which was no good to me anyway. I know you're afraid, but you must protect your kingdom. Amaya blocked him from stepping out onto the observation deck. Sometimes, to preserve what we hold dear, we must be willing to take risks. Think of your people. Think of what will happen if Asha and Starboy continue their carelessness unchecked. Amaya's words dug deep, pressing on Magnifico's fears. He hesitated, glancing toward the locked case where the forbidden book lay. I never wanted to use it, he murmured. But if there is no other way? There is none. They are out of control, and will destroy everything if you do not stop them now. Magnifico walked up to the case, and traced a symbol in the air as he muttered an incantation, so the case clicked open. He retrieved the book, and at his touch, the chain-like border around the cover loosened itself and faded away, then the circular motif of a dragon in the middle uncurled itself, the sunbeams entrapping it lighting up with anticipation. Magnifico's hand faltered, but Amaya was by his side, her presence encouraging. You are doing what is necessary. For roses. Magnifico nodded, then opened the book. He turned to a page he dared not look at before, and as he began to read from it, the air around them grew heavy, thick with dark magic's taint. Black tendrils snaked out from the pages, wrapping around the king's arms, then power surged through him, invigorating and overwhelming. As the spell took hold, something else transformed, too. Amaya's encouraging smile turned into something cold. Magnifico's gaze met hers, and there was satisfied triumph in her eyes. What have you done? Asked Magnifico, too late. Amaya's smile widened. I only helped you to see the truth, my king. Her voice was soaked in spite. You are no longer fit to rule, Magnifico. With you consumed by dark magic, you will bring about your own end, and there will be no one left to stand in my way. Your people will hate you again, especially when they are in the midst of a civil war. Rage and despair filled Magnifico, but the forbidden magic had already taken root. The venom coursed through his veins, warping his will, feeding on his fear and anger, and after this final blow, he was almost willing to succumb to it. All night the astronomy tower's empty, charred shelves loomed over Magnifico, mocking him, reminding him of forgotten wisdom and vain sacrifices as he desperately tried to recall how to dispel darkness. But the poison that snaked through his mind and turned his vision green made each burn on his face sting all the more, and his fists clenched further whenever he remembered the chant his people had chosen earlier, the cackling of the star as it lit him on fire, and Amaya. Her name, once sweet as the moon's glow before sunrise, now tasted bitter on his tongue. She, whom he had trusted beyond measure, had plunged a dagger of betrayal deep into his heart. His headache from the unclean magic was dull enough to make him forget it was there, but pronounced enough to irritate him until all of a sudden, he wanted to plunge himself off the observation deck, onto the unforgiving stones below. His vision was a murky, sickly jade in some spots, and crawled like mildew across the edges, then turned into a sharp, electric lime that stung his eyes before fading back olive. Magnifico attempted to cut through the darkness eclipsing his heart. I will not be possessed, he said aloud. I cannot allow my people to be abandoned when even with their flaws, there is goodness worth preserving. No. It is in people's nature to think of themselves first, he thought again, this time with disdain, and he threw the broken pieces of his staff across the tower with a terrible crash. I have wasted my life. Generosity, it seems, serves only to feed insufferable greed, and no act of kindness prevents a peasant from succumbing to their own nature. I have coddled my people like a youngest child made wretched by its own entitlement. They are ruined by their selfishness, beyond redemption, and no longer worth saving. The snake, still weaving around his mind, stiffened as if tightening into a knot, then it became lodged there indefinitely, and Magnifico was glad. Then he knew what needed to be done. Magnifico took the platform in his courtyard once again, the mended staff in his hand crackling with dark magic. Green sparks radiated around it. The assembled crowd of anxious faces, people who'd been forced from their beds in the middle of the night, fell silent, their attention on the figure creeping back and forth with spider-like fluidity upon the stage. I have gathered you once again, Magnifico began with a new, empty, predatory look in his eyes, glinting green, which made his people cower, to address a threat none but I can truly comprehend. As he spoke, he raised his staff, and with a jerk of it, Green lightning erupted from it that slashed through the air, shaping into claws that tore into a nearby statue. The statue burst, and his subjects recoiled, screaming as chunks fell on them with thunderous thunks. The traitor, Magnifico continued, stalking forward, has allied herself with a malevolent star. Together, they are wreaking havoc, shattering our wishes and defying my authority. With another wave of his staff, Magnifico summoned a tempest of dark wind that funneled around the central fountain. It howled, whipping the waters into a maelstrom that caused the marble to crack under the assault. His subjects gasped. Simon, standing to one side of the stage, was shaking. Magnifico's gaze turned to the young man, his expression dark satisfaction. Simon here, he used his staff to gesture to him, has done his part. With a sweep, a flare of green fire surged out, and flames wrapped around Simon, sculpting into a suit of armor that clung like a second skin. His screams pierced the air as he contorted under relentless heat. When the fire finally receded, he was no longer human. He'd become an enormous, muscled creature resembling a gorilla, and his eyes, now harsh, unblinking green like the king's, were devoid of recognition. He wielded a razor-edged sword. Your wish has been fulfilled, the king declared. Now, find Asha, find the star and their allies, and do not rest until they are dead. He pointed his staff upward, and more green lightning shot into the sky, cleaving the heavens with a crackling burst. The bolt came back to earth with a violent thud, striking the courtyard's edge so the ground shuddered, sending the crowd wobbling on their feet as the sky darkened. A murmur came through the crowd, inaudible at first. Then a young lass broke through and stammered, "My king." She stepped forward. "Please, using dark sorcery is not the way. It isn't right." Magnifico's gaze locked onto her, a merciless smile curling his lips. "It isn't right, is it? You dare to question me?" And with a flick of his wrist, he sent another bolt squarely at her chest, so she crumpled to the ground. The crowd covered their mouths as they shrunk away from her lifeless body. Magnifico leapt down from the platform and stepped over the body without a second glance, his eyes glowing brighter with the green light as he fed off the terror he'd instilled. "Let that be a lesson to all who defy me," his voice echoed through the courtyard as he prowled off, his silhouette stretching long across the stone, until he disappeared into the blackness beyond one of the palace's doors. His subjects watched in shock as their loyalty became overshadowed by this chilling display. Chapter 8. Civil War. Each day, the walls of Magnifico's tower closed further in on him. He saw in the forbidden book's tangling symbols the reflection of his own mind, spiraling, suffocating, desperate to break free. But the darkness continued to slither through his thoughts like a worm, and the vibrant wishes in their chamber turned sickly, their once comforting glow morphing into the same green pallor that crawled beneath his skin, merging with his thoughts until the boundaries between himself and dark magic blurred entirely. Stripped of the meaning that had anchored him, his mind unraveled, and in the silent scream of his soul, he became one with the pages that consumed him. Those days, Magnifico barely noticed the unrest breaking out in the kingdom around him, but eventually it became impossible to ignore. He was just turning a page in his book of forbidden magic when lines of a chant drifted into his ears. "Oh, the king will soon fall, and Asha will reign, our fairy godmother, will ease all our pain. She'll grant every wish that our hearts can desire, while Magnifico falls and burns in a fire. Your Majesty." One of Magnifico's guards came up to his tower one night, out of breath, with a red face. "Your people are conspiring against you. We are hardly able to patrol the streets anymore. In their unrest, they smash and destroy things, and surely you've heard the constant chanting. They hate you. Do they now? Again? How wonderful." Magnifico knew very well that love and hate walked a fine line. As a legendary figure, he'd experienced love easily turning to hate many times. He waved the guard away as he turned another page. "It is not surprising they have decided to show their true colours once more. But ants are nothing to fear. They scuttle and scurry, consumed by their desires, but will soon learn what becomes of those who defy one greater than themselves, who has the ability to crush them. Let them seethe and scurry." But after the guard departed, a bit of green subsided from his vision, and Magnifico's curiosity grew, so eventually he slunk down from his tower, into the village streets to observe these things for himself. Young people were swarming the vicinity, repeating phrases so loudly none were intelligible, and came together to create a sound something like baaing of sheep. "How predictably pitiful," thought Magnifico as he made out one person's cry. "He literally just doesn't want us to be happy." Magnifico exhaled slowly, when someone in the crowd pointed him out. "It's him. It's Magnifico. Guys, I wanna go to talk to him. I wanna talk to Magnifico. And instantly, the king was surrounded by young adults, and he made himself tall and composed in the midst of their clamour as 100 voices tried to talk to him at once. Magnifico, do you have any comments on why you literally hate us? It was the girl with the crutch again, and her expression was as smug as her voice was confident in asserting this logical fallacy. Do you have any comment on why people can't just wish for whatever they want? Magnifico tilted his head to try to hear her better over all the other protesters' cries. Do you have any comment on why your guards were assaulting us at this protest? The tall, dopey teenager asked. They won't let us knock things down. Why do you knock things down? Why can't we wish for anything we want? Magnifico stepped forward. That is a foolish question. Another young adult shoved her way forward. Why do you claim we're dumb freaks who literally can't think for ourselves? I have never said you literally want us to suffer. Listen. Magnifico turned and put a hand on her shoulder. I understand the complexities of fate very well, after studying them for decades, and I can tell you that sounds like a threat. Magnifico raised his voice. I do not believe that granting your wishes will do you any good in the long run. What? Incredulous laughs echoed through the crowd, then it was too loud to string another thought together in the midst of their outrage. The girl with the crutch yelled over them, to say in her most condescending voice, I think I know what's good for myself. No you don't, said Magnifico so calmly his voice was audible over the noise. You think you do, but, guys. A tall teenager burst forward, and stepped in front of the king to say in an even louder voice, I see what he's saying now. I think I see what he's saying. He's just saying we have to be patient, and he'll grant our wishes eventually. Like next week. He turned, smiling, and nodded at Magnifico. That is not what he's saying he doesn't want us to suffer much longer. I am saying that you are pushing over a line that should not be crossed. What's your opinion of our fairy godmother? Your what? Our fairy godmother. She promised she's going to give us literally whatever we want. And who, just then, Asha flashed across his vision, robed in a flowing lavender cape with a hood, a big pink bow under her chin, the slim, white wand between her fingers. Then she disappeared behind a tannery, and Magnifico swore he could hear the stars laugh not far behind her. Enough, he yelled. Enough. There are too many of you. And he pushed through the flock, then stormed back into his castle. For the next week, Magnifico busied himself staring into his book, which hypnotized him more and more, and there were less moments when the green subsided from his vision. He barely noticed anything else, until one day when a commotion outside grew especially loud. Through a window, he glimpsed the silhouettes of Asha and Starboy causing more chaos in the village. Deep furrows carved into his brow, and his eyes narrowed as his mouth turned down into a scowl. He had to do something about them, but his fascination with learning forbidden magic was a distraction. Finally the noise became too loud to ignore, and Magnifico snapped his book shut, then crept down from his tower, and, keeping to the shadows, made his way to the town square where his enemies were fooling around. He pressed his back against a pillar, peering around its edge. Asha twirled through the village with her wand, the sparkles coming out its end trailing in the breeze behind her. She looked determined to use it at every turn. Meanwhile Starboy, perched nearby on an awning, revelled in the spectacle, egging Asha on with laughter as he clapped. Go on Asha, don't be shy. Make it bigger, reach the sky. Asha basked in the attention, giggling as she made a baker's oven grow to the size of a dragon. The oven roared and shot balls of magma from its chamber with startling rumbles. I only asked for a small upgrade. Mr. Burfy watched with hands to his forehead as his bakery was caught up in flames. Oops. Sorry. Asha tried fanning away the smoke with her wand, when someone tapped her on the shoulder so she turned. Can I have 200 cupcakes for free? The spoiled little boy, who was now a man, asked her. You totally can, she said with her back to the catastrophe, and granted his wish as the bakery's roof fell in behind her. From the tip of her wand, a poof of cupcakes materialized, each swirled with frosting in every shade of the rainbow, topped with glittering sprinkles. They multiplied rapidly, spilling out into the street, causing an old lady to slip. The young man clapped and cheered as the baker's fire was forgotten in the whirlwind of frosting and sprinkles. Starboy twirled around a lamppost he'd moved to. Ha ha, Asha, what a scene. They'll never be able to get this clean. Magnifico's frown deepened. In the grip of dark magic, he could care less about the smoke billowing from Mr. Burfy's bakery or flames licking the edges of market stalls. His focus was entirely on his rivals. Their antics were an affront to his carefully curated image of control. Each burst of confection seemed to mock his authority. Magnifico's fingers tapped against the pillar as he plotted how he could kill Asha and Starboy spectacularly in front of everyone. Asha scampered towards the other side of town, where a young lass wished for a pet rhinoceros. Her wand waved, and out popped a massive, thick-skinned mammal with a sharp horn protruding from its snout. It promptly started chasing Starboy, knocking over everything and sending townsfolk running in all directions. The star led it in circles, his chronic snickering encouraging it. "Okay, not what I intended," laughed Asha as a young man was almost paralyzed when he was kicked backwards into a wall. She produced a lasso made of sparkles she tried to corral the creature with, but it only entangled a couple peasants who became enchanted, then joined the creature in its dizzying dance. Finally Starboy shook the creature off, and floated up beside Asha to cheer. Well, look at them go. They are putting on quite a show." He flew high above the fleeing peasants and ruined buildings, just in time to watch as the statue of King Magnifico got its head knocked off. It fell to the ground where it smashed into 1,000 pieces. The once orderly kingdom was a wreck. By now the entire village gathered to confront Asha, encircling her, all covered in many things from ashes to glitter to pie filling. Some were covered in blood. Okay, Asha shouted over the angry mob, her wand waving frantically to try and undo the mess she'd created. "I'll fix everything. It's not that big of a deal. Just give me a second." Magnifico, looking around the wall of a smouldering shoe shop, let his lips curl into a smirk. The entire village gathered into one spot, he thought. How convenient. His grasp tightened around his staff, and he imagined Asha and Starboy, surrounded by the throng of disgruntled subjects, meeting their end in a climatic show before them all. But before he stepped out to reveal himself, he watched curiously as the peasants slipped on frosting and the rhinoceros barreled past, then an even darker grin spread across his face. Why end this when he could plunge the town into even greater disarray, just for the joy of it? Perhaps Asha and Starboy were onto something. His ungrateful subjects deserved a lesson, and granting wishes could indeed be great fun. With sudden, wicked inspiration, Magnifico decided to join them. He walked out into plain view. "Ho, ho, ho," he announced, his voice a booming parody of cheerfulness. "Who's ready for a wish?" The townsfolk, momentarily stunned by the sight of their feared king, hesitated, before their eyes lit up with hope, and typically, they immediately forgot he'd recently committed a murder. His subjects ran up to him with gleaming eyes. "I want a dragon," one squealed. "I wish for a castle," another called out. Magnifico's staff glowed with dark magic as he waved it theatrically. For each wish, he conjured grand manifestations in flashes of green. A dragon with ebony scales and evil eyes appeared, hissing as it coiled around the square, thrashing buildings to splinters with a barbed tail. A castle of shadowy spires rose from the ground, its piercing turrets sending subjects scattering out of their way. Asha and Starboy, hanging back, watching the king from the sidelines with open mouths, soon crept forward, their shocked, suspicious expressions melting into ones of excitement. "Look at that!" Asha clapped her hands. "Magnifico's really getting into the spirit." Starboy hovered beside her, a smile splitting his face. "He's making this a grand display. I've never seen wishes done this way." He flew around the dragon, darting in and out of its coils as it crushed Farmer Finnegan's garden. Magnifico's shoulders shook with laughter as he watched the unrest. Each time a wish was fulfilled, the kingdom was wrecked further. Galloping unicorns with stabbing horns, mountains of gold coins that squashed his subjects, and stupider suggestions still, all executed with purest judgment. "This is the best." Asha turned to Magnifico. "See how sharing is caring. It's so much fun to make dreams come true." Magnifico's laughter rang louder. The more carnage he created, the more his sense of control returned. But as the evening wore on, his generosity revealed its true cost. A wish for endless sweets resulted in clogged streets, and when a drizzle started, it melted into sticky sugar that ruined everything it touched, so people's demands turned into abstract contradictions. One woman, caught in the deluge of stickiness, wished loudly, "Only I should be able to make wishes," at the same time as another man. These pleas warped materiality, so that every time either of them made a wish, their personal reality became disconnected from the rest of the kingdom, fulfilling their desires in isolated loops of their own making. Matters were convoluted further when Mr. Burfy, desperate to reclaim his bakery, cried out, "All wishes should have good results." The effect was that everyone began to disbelieve in magic, because things remained the same when no one could define good, let alone understand what was good for them. Subjective wishes couldn't become objective realities, filling the people with doubt, so they began fighting amongst themselves. Another woman, driven by desperation, wished to transport herself to a future where she could escape the troubles, but didn't anticipate the consequences when the total matter of the universe, which needs to remain constant, was disturbed by her appearance, causing an anomaly that resulted in a catastrophic explosion when she arrived. Time travel, unlike producing things from thin air, does not simply relocate mass. The more Magnifico's subjects tried to mend things, the more tangled everything became. "I wish you'd go somewhere far away," a disgruntled scrivener, shaking a fist, yelled at Magnifico, so the staff in his hand winked, and with a sputtering pop, the king vanished. Moments later, he reappeared, robes singed. Crystals clung to his hair and clothes, and he collapsed to his knees. His vision had narrowed to a pinprick, and he had a feeling in his chest of being crushed that left him gasping for breath. He was scarred from briefly visiting a silicon dimension inhospitable to carbon atoms. "No more wishes," he barked, slamming his staff into the ground to heal himself from the consequences of travelling there under high G acceleration. Asha and Starboy, admiring the scene as they sat cross-legged on the outskirts of town, were caught off guard when Magnifico turned his attention back toward them. "I've had enough of this charade." His voice dropped to a growl. "Now it's time for the grand finale." He raised his staff high, and a torrent of green light flashed toward them as banshees materialized, spectral figures reed in fire, their wails rising from the depths of the netherworld, bursting the eardrums of those around them, filling witnesses with dread. Asha screeched, and her wand swiftly produced a counterspell, a purple cloud, which crashed into the dark army, so they disappeared in a short puff. Starboy, in a rare moment of seriousness, zipped in front of her, shielding her with his cape that more of Magnifico's spells, coming like angry green hornets, bounced off all. He cried, "Hey, you're not playing fair. We were just getting a breath of air. Thought you were with us, on our team. We should have known you had a scheme. You will both die tonight." Magnifico thrust his staff downward so a fiery streak cut through the sky, and the ground shuddered as meteors rained down, flaming boulders that scorched the earth. Asha narrowly avoided a direct hit, tumbling aside as one obliterated the spot where she'd stood. One singed Starboy's cape, sending him spiraling around like a leaf. Before he could regain balance, the temperature plummeted and the air grew frigid. Howling wind tore through the square as ice shards sliced everything in their path. Asha conjured a shield, but the relentless cold bit through her defense, and forced her stumbling backward. The skies above churned with winds and dark clouds, coiling like serpents. Then the earth cracked open. Simon, one of the last remaining citizens who hadn't hid, stared glassily at the destruction as if impressed. He'd been using his sword now and then to add to the violence, but was too confused to be much use, even in his new, gorilla-like form. "I have better use for you yet," said Magnifico, and slashed his scepter forward to knock Simon off his feet, into the rip in the earth. A second later, from its depths emerged a massive form, a leviathan as big as a house that climbed forth. As Simon the beast crawled toward the king, his sinewy limbs contorted beneath a leathery hide that barely contained the dark magic bubbling beneath. His face was a blend of bat and serpent, and he scanned the now mostly empty village with yellow eyes, while his mouth, lined with uneven teeth made from his shattered sword, snapped up everything in its path. The hunched creature's arched spine jutted like a cliffside, and his tail, spiked and wiry, swatted the few people left who hadn't run for cover out of his way. Simon charged, bellowing as his hooves shook the earth with each step. Magnifico chanted a spell under his breath, causing the creature to halt and its spine to lower. The ridged back formed a stairway the king strode up. When he took his place atop it, the leviathan shuddered, but Magnifico tightened his grip on Simon's scales, bending the creature to his will. Below, Asha and Starboy didn't have time to marvel. The moment Magnifico settled on the leviathan, it trampled forward with a roar. Asha grabbed the back of Starboy's cape, and they bolted for cover underneath the castle's nearest archway. The castle seemed an escape route, since the leviathan's bulk could not fit into the narrow passages, but the walls were smashed down around them as they ran through its maze of hallways. A chunk of stone landed on Starboy's cape, which he had to yank off with a rip, and another cracked Asha's wand in too. "Oh no," she cried. Every turn they took funneled them upward, the beast's relentless pursuit forcing them higher and higher up the castle's winding staircases. As the passages widened, the higher they got, the beast finally broke through, and they could no longer hide from it as it charged after them. Up we go to the tower's top. Hurry now, and do not stop, Starboy cried as he carried Asha along, zipping up the steps with inhuman speed. They made it to the pinnacle of the tallest tower, and a moment later the Leviathan's head burst through the stairwell entrance, its eyes locking onto them. They were trapped in Magnifico's observatory. This is where he keeps his people's deepest desires locked up, Asha told Starboy, pointing to the wall concealing the wish chamber. Starboy got a glint in his eye, and flew in front of the wall, so the Leviathan rammed right into it just after he flew out of its way. Dust filled the air as the wall was reduced to rubble. Asha gasped, because the once breathtaking wish chamber was not the way she remembered it at all. The wishes had turned black, and some rolled around on the floor as if filled with lead. Rather than a hopeful hum, a barely audible, high-pitched screeching emanated from them, gripping the tower's occupants like a rooster's crow, yanking them from good dreams, destined for a day of dreary duties. Only a few wishes remained themselves, a terrible contrast that could fill a soul with depression, and it would have been better never to have seen the desires at all. What's happened to the wishes, once shining so bright? This is a terrible, heart-wrenching sight. Starboy flew up to the chamber's dome ceiling, tapping one of the only remaining glowing wishes. Magnifico laughed again, and atop the Leviathan, reached out for a good wish. He clenched his fist around it so it burst. Then his breath hitched, because the light within flew out like a trapped bird and pierced his chest. At his core, he felt the deep passion merge with him and infuse him with more power. His eyes widened as he realized what had happened. The wishes were raw energy, distilled from the hopes and dreams of those who made them, and he could absorb this every time he crushed one underfoot or smashed one with a fist. He set to work immediately, grasping every wish within his reach. You know, I think Magnifico is getting a little carried away, Asha said to Starboy as they observed him. The Leviathan cornered them just as the roof began to shift, groaning as mechanisms stirred to life at Magnifico's command. What had appeared to be solid stone fractured into segments, each piece sliding away from the center like petals of a flower. As the tower's roof opened, the floor of the wish chamber rose, and Asha shivered in the cold night air as it emerged into the sky. The last remaining wishes floated out with them, flowing up like a fountain of refreshing water from which no one was allowed to drink. The view from the top, oh what a sight! The world down below, bathed in golden light. Starboy enjoyed the spectacle despite his impending doom. Magnifico descended Simon, who shrunk back to himself, then fell over on his back, half dead from shock. Magnifico kicked his body aside, onto one of the tower's segmented platforms, no longer needing him with his new power. His transformation began immediately. Magnifico gritted his teeth as black feathers erupted from his back, tearing through his robes. The weight of the wings was nothing compared to the might he felt, fueled by all the wishes he'd ever denied. They dripped green electricity, each feather's point sharp as a knife. It's so nice to get whatever I want, he snarled. Magnifico backed Asha like prey to the edge of the platform, the roof sections forming a spiky star over which only clouds could be seen. He sliced his staff through the air so each of the points became a mirror of his terrible face, his grin feral as he furled and unfurled his wings. Starboy flew around them uselessly, too scared to touch them as Magnifico's reflections transformed into nightmarish distortions around them. From behind the king's reflections, shadows began to pour forth, long and creeping, which also surrounded Asha. Below, Roses was drenched in darkness, overrun with slinking tendrils that ensnared every subject, wrapping around their necks, bending them, forcing their gazes upward to observe the spectacle above them. Starboy tossed a fireball at the nearest mirror, which merely bounced off and flew through the air like a comet, a bright streak against the darkness. It struck something in the distance with a terrible crack, and there was a shatter, but it wasn't a mirror breaking, even though it sounded like one. A web of cracks spread across the distant night sky, and a flash of light even greater than the first momentarily blinded every subject in the kingdom. Oops, said Starboy. Look what happened to the eclipse enclosure. My hand just slipped, bringing exposure. No matter. Magnifico flapped forward, his wings casting the shadow of a giant bat over the star. We'll all be dead before the Earth finishes its next rotation. Have you ever wished to see a black hole up close? Starboy stroked his chin as he floated around the king. No, I've never quite cared to see, interesting though a black hole may be. Well, savor this sight that will be your last. Magnifico plunged his staff downward, producing a swirling black vortex that ripped open in the sky, debris and loose objects whirling into it from the pull of gravity. Asha and Starboy struggled against its force, screeching as they swirled around the rooftop. Starboy was able to resist to some degree, and kept himself and Asha in his grip, on the edge, though they slowly inched closer and closer to the eerily perfect circle. Magnifico, eyes locked onto the growing void, kept on muttering incantations, his focus solely on his creation. As it grew, its spill caused him to stumble, then, just as quickly as he'd thought this through, its hunger overpowered him. He was sucked into what had become a whirlpool of misused magic that could no longer make sense of itself. With a guttural scream, the king was swallowed by his own black hole, and with no tether to the dimension, it imploded with a deafening crack, blinking out of existence. The sky around the rooftop grew brighter, and fell silent, leaving Asha and Starboy amidst the debris, their eyes wide as they gasped in the sudden calm. Starboy floated down, and set Asha back on the platform. "Uh-oh," he said, looking toward the horizon where the enclosure once glowed. "I think we broke all the protections. What if Magnifico sneaks back in with worse intentions? Magnifico won't be coming back." Asha clutched a stitch in her side as she caught her breath. "I think he just brought about his own end." Chapter 9. Magnifico's Metamorphosis. Magnifico was towed downward by the black hole's current, the edges of his robes unraveling into threads. He felt himself stretching, as if time itself was taking him apart, strand by strand. Space had swapped places with time, and hurled him toward the void's inevitable singularity. His head and feet pulled in opposite directions as intense gravity stretched him unthinkably thin. As his torso elongated, his legs did not immediately catch up, and the pressure on his head intensified. His arms and legs became uselessly long threads. Horrifically, the magic in his blood denied him death until he became a smeared streak. When his soul was finally released, then he floated out of himself. Magnifico, now immaterial, continued his descent. Then, below, in the blackness from which no light could escape, he began to see dozens of embers. It turns out some light survives after passing through the event horizon's boundary. As Magnifico sank deeper, time crawled slower and slower, and the lights, getting closer, grew brighter, revealing themselves to be dimming stars. Not alive like the one he'd met, but cold, colourless orbs. Gravity no longer affected him, so Magnifico floated leisurely through their midst. The stars' surfaces were webbed with cracks that spilled streams of gold like blood. Some flickered weakly, while others were grey and lightless, perhaps dead, but they were all doomed to spin round together in the current. One floated through Magnifico, its edges curled inward as if it were devouring itself. They clustered in groups, grazing each other, shedding shards of brilliance like falling snow, while a few floated alone, then disappeared into the blackness beyond. Magnifico watched one brighter star shrink away from him as if it knew he were there. He watched the creeping shadows where the star vanished, that were creating patterns around him. An endless staircase led downward, each step dripping with despair as it dissolved into nothingness. Then the shadows became piercing shards that hurled themselves at him, and stabbed through him, though they only passed through him like smoke. These burst into fragments like pieces of glass from his terrible mirrors, and Magnifico finally saw his own reflection in them. The eyes of his shadow self were empty and sunken, and he did not recognize himself. The darkness closed in, and laughter rang out from each of his reflections. Then Magnifico realized they were one and the same with him. At this understanding, the dark magic's grip loosened a tiny bit, and he knew that to reclaim his sanity, he would have to confront these distortions of himself. As he drifted further down, a shadow formed into the shape of a man. "Is that?" Now Magnifico knew he was dead. "I think I remember you." The words he'd said to Asha earlier, during her interview, echoed through his mind. He was a philosopher, was he not? Had great magic running through his blood, always warning people about the consequences of getting whatever your heart desires. It was him, Asha's father, the renowned philosopher. The tall man with a short beard and an eye patch over his right eye, whose hair still stuck straight up after being killed by lightning, spoke. "Remember when magic was the pursuit of knowledge, not a weapon of tyranny?" Magnifico studied the philosopher, then he nearly laughed. "I should have known you would appear here to mock me. You always were popping up at the most inconvenient of times. But save your laughter. You speak falsely. Magic is not knowledge, it is power. That is all it has ever been." He found communicating intuitive despite no longer having a body, and could not explain how. Time became so slow it was as if they no longer moved at all, and Magnifico could not look away from the man. "Is that all the philosophy you have gained in 160 years? The philosopher's gaze pierced him. Or have you forgotten yourself in the midst of wielding power so mindlessly? Mindlessly. Of course you would think me irrational. But I have learned more than you can fathom. A kingdom is built on power, not ideals. The philosopher flickered. And it is no use telling me your philosophies for the 100th time. Magnifico had no wish for his old friend to open his mouth to condescend to him again. I know very well you had too much faith in people when you were alive. You liked to claim human nature was inherently good, unselfish, and non-violent. That if you let them govern themselves, they'd remain civilized out of their own free will. But you have not witnessed all the evidence to the contrary, the likes of which I have seen. The philosopher stayed mercifully silent, and continued to listen to Magnifico. Even you admitted that no one should be able to get whatever they want, Magnifico pleaded with the man to understand. But did you actually believe people had the fortitude to deny themselves their desires when they were so closely within their grasp? Did you not see every sign, that as soon as they saw someone to blame for their troubles, they would turn on the person who gave them everything? To Magnifico's relief, the philosopher went on listening to him. And do you know why the sacrifice was too great for me to bear? Magnifico paused, and watched some of the shadows recede. It almost looked as if they'd changed directions and were now ascending, but time was too slow to tell. I ask you, he continued, was it worth it when every spark of magic I've cast has taken a physical toll on my body? When every spell turned another hair silver and demanded a piece of my soul? Even when I put magic aside, they did not appreciate my efforts. I walked across hot coals to save a child, and when she grew older she scorned me for denying her a chance to wield power herself. She cursed my name, as if I had been the one to bring her pain. Now Magnifico became aware that they were certainly ascending. The dying stars had all disappeared, and the darkness was giving way to something brighter. She asked me for salvation in a way I could not give, and when I denied it from her, she turned to the very darkness I sought to protect her from. The philosopher's expression had softened, and he finally spoke again. For years, I argued that humanity's strength lay in their freedom, and ability to choose their own paths. He said this slowly, as if measuring every word. But it seems I was blind to the realities of my idealistic philosophy. A wise ruler guides his people away from their worst instincts. Now the question is not whether they need a ruler, but whether you can be one without losing yourself. You speak as though power is the only truth, but even wisdom can falter under unchecked power. Magnifico considered the man's words before offering a response. I have lost myself, he admitted, and glanced at one of his reflections again. I have done unforgivable deeds in the last few days. The lines blurred, and I became a tyrant for the sake of control. But tell me, who could bear this burden and not break under it? If I could put the pieces of my reflection back in the order they were meant to be, unaltered and true. Try, said the philosopher. I see now that that is your only hope. Put yourself back in order, Magnifico, as you were meant to be. Magnifico found himself face to face with the shards, and he could not, though he wished to, take his eyes off his unrecognizable reflection. How? He asked. How can I change myself, when I understand so well the reasons I became this way? Look. He noticed a scar across his neck reflected back at him. There is another mark of wasted effort. From the day I saved a man from drowning, the same who threw himself back into the sea, the day I could not give him the answers he sought. He begged me for meaning, and I had nothing to offer but empty words. He called me a fraud, and I suppose he was right. How can I reshape a reflection cracked and worn, when every scar tells a tale of failure? Magnifico's voice shook, his gaze fixed on the broken image. If I could fix this mirror, piece by piece, I would. But tell me, philosopher, is it even possible to rebuild a man whose very foundation was flawed? The scars you see are not the marks of failure. The philosopher's reflection joined Magnifico's in the cracked mirror, startling him. They are the wages of a soul that dared to act, of a life spent giving. They are not flaws, but proof of your humanity. To fix the mirror, you need to see your reflection for what it is, an image of every choice you've made. And when you do, you'll find it is not beyond repair. It was not broken to begin with. I do not believe that is so. Look harder, Magnifico. Every sacrifice you've made turned out to be the development of a virtue, like patience, fortitude, empathy and humility. By walking across hot coals to save the girl, you exhibited courage and love, despite the consequences. Sacrifices are not in vain. Yours shaped you into someone capable of profound understanding and wisdom. For a long moment, Magnifico said nothing as he studied himself in the shards. Through the cracks he saw, above his scar, the burns across his face from his duel with the star. Then his attention turned to his disfigured hands, worn from towering over beakers as he'd concocted so many cures for others over the years. He did not remember when his hair had turned white, and thought it had only been grey the day before. One eyebrow was singed off, and he remembered the day he'd lost it, when a potion had gone wrong and exploded in his face. He'd been trying to save some girl's mother and succeeded, but she'd never told him whether he had, and he'd had to send one of his guards to find out the information for himself. His entire reflection sagged under exhaustion, and he did not look like a king. There were many other things he did not admire about his reflection. His expression was cold, his lips turned down in bitterness, and his eyes were hard, disillusioned, even sarcastic. His reflection clutched the dark scepter like a lifeline, and there was desperation in his stance that bent him like a spider. Magnifico allowed his mind to drift back to when he'd first set out on his path, when magic had not seemed a burden, but a gift. He recalled the faces of those he'd helped, and the gratitude in their eyes when they'd looked at him not as a sorcerer, but as someone who understood their pain. He'd chosen to help them for all the scars it left, because it had been worth it. Virtue is not earned through contentment, but through enduring hardship, the philosopher told him. I see what you're saying, said Magnifico presently. But unfortunately I have not been a perfect martyr. I have made many mistakes as well as sacrifices. I have often wondered. I have always doubted. I have not felt entirely at ease with all of my decisions. For example, when I decreed that only wishes that would benefit my kingdom should be granted, one of the consequences was that my subjects would lose all memory of their deepest desires once they surrendered them to me. It could not be helped, as part of the enchantment, but I often doubted it was really for the better. You were deceived, Magnifico. The philosopher's voice grew grave. Amaya, your wife, knew the power of those wishes, and concealed the truth from you. There was never a need for your subjects to lose the memory of their desires. Every sketch or scribble your people put down before giving their wish to you, in hopes of outwitting you, needn't have burst into flames. She used your kindness against you, manipulating you into believing that their forgotten wishes were a necessary sacrifice, when there are other ways the spell could have been performed. Magnifico had no reply to this, feeling a fool. He had trusted Amaya so deeply he had never thought to question this. Did you know, the philosopher continued, it was she who let the girl, Asha, into your tower with her torch. It was she who unlocked the door, and she who encouraged the burning of all your books, save one, the one she desperately wanted you to read. She would stop at nothing to get you out of the way, so she could take the wish's raw energy for herself. You are shifting the blame, when I am just as accountable for my own possession. Magnifico still had trouble believing the depths of Amiya's betrayal. Perhaps that is so, said the philosopher. But you have the desire to put things right after all. So, try Magnifico. Try to put them right. My people need a just and wise ruler to guide them, not someone corrupted by hunger for power and control. Sadness filled Magnifico. I only wish that I was that ruler. At these words, the fragments of glass rearranged themselves and joined together. Their cracks mended themselves as if being filled in by magic. Then they disappeared entirely and the mirror was whole, and the reflection of the king's white robes inside it grew radiant and blinding. Magnifico's vision flickered from the intensity, when, all of a sudden, in a final burst of white, it ceased, and then to his shock everything around him was gone. Chapter 10, Roses Restored. Magnifico awoke on top of his tower. The hopeful hum of the wishes had returned. He sat up on the stone-cold floor, and stared at them floating in the dawn without a reverence for so long he almost forgot his kingdom was still in ruins. He reached out to let one land on a finger. How glorious! The skies above told him 2 days had passed since he'd entered the black hole. He had so much time before him now. Magnifico got to his feet, and walked out onto the edge of a platform. He looked down upon his kingdom of sticky rubble and wreck. I have a great deal of amends to make, he sighed as he bowed his head. And I do not blame my people if they do not forgive me after this. The first thing he did was to snap his dark staff in two, and toss it over the tower's side into the sea. He picked up his old, less potent scepter and used it to close up his tower again, its spiked platforms folding in from their star-shaped back into a dome that protected the wishes once more. Then he went down from his tower, out into the streets where he used it to stop the rhinoceros still barreling around. He shrunk the animal down to the size of a mouse, and gave it to a little girl skipping past to keep as a pet, and she was too overjoyed to be scared of him when he handed it to her. Why bless my soul, it's Magnifico, said a peasant woman when she saw him strolling around the town, putting things back in order. It is I. he said as he shot down the dragon with a fiery arrow from his scepter. That crashed down into the forest, and he looked so disarmingly cheerful that a grin nearly escaped her as she took in his metamorphosis, and everyone wondered what had come over him a second time. Magnifico was in such high spirits that if he were wearing a crown and it was knocked off his head by the wind, he'd have been too cheerful to notice and gone right on without it. Next he sealed up the tears in the earth, then herded the stampede of unicorns into a gated pasture to give to Farmer Finnegan as an apology for destroying his other livelihood, after which he turned to the dark castle he'd grown out of the ground and shrunk it into a merry-go-round for children to ride in the middle of his courtyard. He found that everything could be reshaped into something joyful. "Good morning, sir," he said to the baker as he put his bakery back in order with a few zaps. "Such a fine craft you've perfected. I have always held it in high regard." Once all his paradoxes and anomalies had been sorted out with some serious conundrum solving that left his head in a girdle, and he was sure each of his subjects were as safe as could be, he went down to the edge of the forest where he found Asha and Starboy bouncing up and down on a discarded trampoline in the shade of the trees, and walked up to them. The pale white wand in Asha's hand had been mended, and she held it carelessly above her head as she bounced, a few sparks leaking out its end that she didn't even notice. "A fine day to you," Magnifico called to them, and their mouths fell open at the sight of him. They ceased bouncing. "What have we here, my dears? Let's have a look." He approached them with a smile on his face. Asha's face scrunched up into the same one she'd made when her WhatIWish had been yanked from her days earlier. "Go away," she told the king. "Everyone was a lot better off without you. Do you think anyone is going to listen to a big stupid head when they could listen to me? People just have to believe in themselves to make their dreams come true. You just have to follow your heart, and anything is possible. All it takes is a little faith and a wish upon a star." Enough of these idiotic phrases. Magnifico plucked the mended wand from her hand, and snapped it in two with a satisfying crunch. Asha's face went pale, and her jaw nearly hit the ground. "Asha, it seems you've finally earned yourself a proper sentence," he said, and raised his scepter, but Starboy was ready, and the fire he shot from his palms collided with Magnifico's spell. But this time, the fire was no match for the white light bursting from the king's scepter, and the star was not prepared to be hurled backward into the trees like a worthless gnat. Starboy emerged from the prickly plants with the look of a crumpled fly, his hair, full of prickers, sticking up as if he'd been electrocuted. He staggered forward, too dizzy to walk straight, and cried, "The earth's a mess, there's no more delight, I'm done with this, time to take flight." He shook his hair back to normal as he leapt into the air, and a suitcase materialized in his hand. "I've had my fill, this game's a bore, I can't take humans anymore. I'm packing my bags, going off with a zoom, no more human games, I'll return to the moon." "Wait," called Asha as Starboy disappeared in a streak of light like a comet, right after which Magnifico sealed up the eclipse enclosure behind him with his scepter, stronger and more secure than ever, ensuring he could never breach the realm again. Asha's lip trembled as she watched. Magnifico turned to her. "For your insolence, you will tend the chickens kept by your people day after day, from sunrise to sunset. No magic, no shortcuts. You will protect them and learn to do some good for society." And with a flash, he transported her back to the hamlet, where she materialized surrounded by chickens inside a run closed off with barbed wire, outside which she could not step foot without getting a zap. From then on, Asha had no choice but to follow the chickens, feed them, sweep up their dirty hay, and gather their eggs, all to the tune of relentless clucking. With no escape, she slowly, but eventually learned to focus on her tasks until she found a strange rhythm in the routine that wasn't quite pleasure, though she was no longer restless and wishful. The same night she received her sentence, Magnifico gathered his guards into a search party to find Amaya, who had gone into hiding after his disappearance. "I fear she is like a serpent in tall grass, watching and waiting to strike," he told his guards. "She must be found and captured at once." It was only midnight when his guards returned with his wife, who had been hiding out in a cave in the forest. "Magnifico, I was possessed," she tried to lie as the guards dragged her off to the dungeons. "I do not know what came over me. It was the dark magic, I swear it was." Her protests faded as she was marched down the dark lower stairwell out of sight. That night, the castle was silent, and by the next morning Magnifico was ready to address his people, though he did not look forward to it. He called another gathering in his courtyard with a heavy heart. "I was wrong to erase the memories of your dreams," he confessed to his subjects, who peered up at him with unreadable faces. Your wishes are the very essence of who you are. I have failed you all in many ways over the last few days. If I could pass on my magic to someone else better than I would. All the harm I have done to this kingdom, I have done with my own hands, even under the influence of dark magic. For that, I am deeply sorry. He paused, scanning the faces of the people before him, but they were still unreadable. The magic I wielded was too powerful, and I allowed it to take over my mind and my heart. I hurt you, and for that, there is no excuse. The courtyard was silent enough to hear a feather fall. I am training Simon, Magnifico continued, not only to be my sorcerer's apprentice, but to be the king this kingdom deserves. A king who will not be blinded by ambition or consumed by power, but one who will listen to his people and protect their dreams, not erase them. There were a few claps at this, and as the young man walked out onto the stage, the applause grew louder. Magnifico took a step forward, his voice rising a bit. I've already begun undoing the damage I have done, and will continue to do so. I restored the memories of your dreams, and have set the kingdom right where I can. Where I've faltered, I will work harder, and I will accept the consequences I deserve. He swallowed, then added, more quietly, but I will also strive to be the king you deserve. One who learns from his mistakes and stands with you, always. The people looked to one another, uncertainty still in the air. Then there was a hesitant, unsure clap. A few more began, then the sound swelled as others joined in, until their applause finally filled the courtyard, and it was then, as Magnifico stood in their forgiveness, that he knew every sacrifice he'd made had shaped him into the man he was meant to become. This is because, while a wish calls us forward, it is through sacrifice that we fulfill them. Epilogue. Months later, the Kingdom of Roses gathered for another wish-granting ceremony. They were now held annually rather than monthly, yet the people were more patient than ever, having grown in virtue, and there was no desperate reaching or grabbing this time. All knew well the consequences of a wish not thought through, and stood gratefully with gazes lifted to the sky, where thousands of radiant lights danced above them. Some of the people whispered prayers, while others just smiled hopefully, but they all wondered of their wish, in their new understanding, will this bring good to others, or only to myself? One woman, even after spotting her wish, let it drift past, resisting its spell, and turned to her family to say, I have enough. A little boy reached out, then stopped, looking to his parents for guidance, and an elderly woman whispered, I have lived long enough to know that sometimes, what we need is not more, but less. Magnifico, watching his subjects, felt eternally grateful to be their king, and proud when he selected a most beautiful wish. My dear subjects, he said, and bowed deeply as he said it is my greatest pleasure to grant this wish, one that will truly benefit our kingdom and all of you today. And with a wave of his scepter, the earth responded, and in an instant, white flowers bloomed from every crack in every stone, from the trees, and along the edges of the roads. They were clusters of white bells, hanging from green stalks, and their petals fluttered like snow through the air, carrying a sweet scent. It looked like spring, though the air was frosty. Cocoons hung from each flower, and they broke open at the same time. Then white butterflies emerged that joined the petals in their fluttering. At that moment it began to snow in gentle flakes, and the world turned white entirely. The wish for these flowers, explained Magnifico, was not just for beauty, but to remind us of the importance of growth and patience. They will bloom eternally, even in the cold, to remind us of what is precious. As the last butterfly took flight, a hush settled over the crowd, and the Kingdom of Roses stood together in quiet reverence. And in the silence, the kingdom, together, made a vow to grow in gratitude. The end.